Today our topic is, do animals have rights? From Chapman University, we are proud to host Dr. Tibor Machan. Dr. Machan is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a former adjunct faculty member at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Dr. Machan is a syndicated columnist, author of more than 100 scholarly papers, more than 30 books, most recently The Promise of Liberty. Dr. Machan graduated at Fairmont McKenna College and earned a Master's of Arts in Philosophy at NYU and a PhD in Philosophy at University of California in Santa Barbara.
With us today is our beloved Professor Francione. He distinguished Professor of Law and Nicholas Packlenbach Scholar of Law and Philosophy. Professor Francione earned his BA at the University of Rochester and JD at the University of Virginia, where he served as articles editor of the University of Virginia Law Review. He then clerked for Judge Tate of the Fifth Circuit and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor of the United States Supreme Court. Professor Francione practiced at the law school in Moore, was a member of the University of Pennsylvania faculty, known for his work on animal rights, and is the author of numerous books on this topic. And without further ado, present. Yes.
All right. Well, who would have ever thought that the Friends of the Federal Society would refer to me as a beloved? Touching moment. Thank you for setting this up. The topic is, do animals have rights? The answer is yes. No. Look, let me be clear. I'm going to take the proposition, obviously, but in taking the proposition, I want to make clear, when I'm talking about animal rights, I'm not talking about affirmative rights, rights to vote, rights to drive cars, rights to do this, rights. I'm talking about one negative right, the right not to be regarded exclusively as a resource, not to be regarded as property. Now, I want to make two observations about that one right. Number one, if we accept that one right, it has a profound effect on how we think about animals and how we behave toward animals. Because basically, once you accept that we don't have a right to treat animals exclusively as human resources, we have to stop consuming them, eating them, wearing them, otherwise using them. So, again, I'm not talking about affirmative rights, I'm talking about one negative right. You accept the one negative right, it has tremendous implications. Second observation I want to make is, as radical as that sounds, it's actually not radical at all. As a matter of fact, I'm going to convince you today that it fits completely within what you already think. It may not, your behavior may not be consistent with it, but the argument I'm going to make, you accept it. The question is whether or not you get to the conclusion. Same conclusion. Now look, when we talk about animal rights, the standard argument is, well, animals can't have rights. Why not? Because animals lack some special characteristic that humans have. And that because animals lack this special characteristic, they're outside the moral community, they can't be rights holders. Now, the special characteristic through history, we're talking about several thousand years of thinking, has been things like rationality, ability to use abstract thought, ability to use symbolic communication or language, or being a moral agent. So, because animals lack one or more of these special characteristics, they don't count. We can exclude them. They don't have rights. We have rights. They don't have rights. We have the special characteristic. They don't have the special characteristic. Let's focus on one of the special characteristics, because the argument really, the form of the argument is the same for all these things, but let's just focus on one of them to make it more concrete. And that is the argument that animals are not moral agents, and therefore they can't have rights. Well, what's a moral agent? It's somebody who's capable of responding to rights claims and understanding that they have obligations. We're all moral agents. You can make claims on me, I can make claims on you, I have obligations to you, you have obligations to me. We are moral agents. Okay? So because we say animals are not moral agents, we exclude them from the moral community. They don't count. They're not rights holders. All right? Now, what about babies? Babies are not moral agents. They're not capable of responding to rights claims or having obligations. Well, the standard response is, yes, but babies, they become, adults and they become moral agents. What happens if you have a baby who's going to die in 3 months? Is it all right to use that baby in a painful experiment, or to eat that baby, or to do something with that baby because that baby is never going to become a moral agent. What about people who are permanently mentally disabled and will never be moral agents? What about those people? Now, the response to that generally is, well, but, you know, those are humans. You know, baby's going to die, baby's still a human. A mentally disabled person, still a human. So they count, they get rights, but animals don't. Think about that for a second. Think about it. Let's assume you have an animal who's not a moral agent, and you have a human being who's severely mentally disabled. You say, well, the severely mentally disabled human still has rights because that person is a member of the human species, but the animal doesn't. Think about what you're arguing. We have this thing that we all accept called principle of equal consideration, that we ought to treat similar cases similarly. So here we've got two similar cases. We've got an animal who's not a moral agent, a human who's not a moral agent. All right? And we say, we're going to treat them differently, and we're going to give rights to we're going to treat the human as if the human was dissimilar to the animal. We're going to give the human rights because the human is a human, because of species. That's not an argument. It's a statement about our species bias or speciesism. Think about it in a human context. What if I were to say to you, we've got two similarly situated humans, a male and a female. But we're going to give greater weight to the interests of the male because he has a sex that we value more in a sexist, patriarchal society. Or imagine we have a gay person and a straight person. And they're similarly situated, but we're going to give greater weight to the interests of the straight person because the straight person has a characteristic, i.e. being straight, that we value in a homophobic, heterosexist society. It wouldn't work. It doesn't work in the animal context as well to say, well, the human that doesn't have moral agency is still a member of the moral community, still has rights because of species. And the answer is, that's a statement about speciesism. It's not a moral justification of speciesism. And let me say, as a general matter, the argument for special consideration, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's being a moral agent, being rational, having abstract thought, being able to use symbolic communication. I mean, look at the concept of intelligence. Well, you know, animals are not as cognitively sophisticated as we are. Think about this for a second. What we do is, that sort of whole way of arguing and thinking is question begging. It's circular. It says animals are excluded because they don't have human characteristics. But what is the moral value of the human characteristic? Why is being able to do calculus any better than being able to swim underwater without an air tank, or being able to fly without being in an airplane? I mean, we look at our characteristics and we say, they're special. Think about it again. Let's move the argument in a human context and we see the problem. You look at cognitive sophistication. Within the human species, there are many levels of cognitive sophistication. People very intelligent, people not very intelligent. Now, are those differences relevant? They may be relevant for certain purposes. You might want to pay somebody more who is a brain surgeon than someone who is a janitor. I mean, I'm in favor of a more socialist distribution pattern, but I appreciate where I'm speaking today, and I'm not going to get into that. But let's assume. I mean, let's assume that you say, look, I can justify differential compensation for the brain surgeon as opposed to the janitor. Okay, so for purposes of compensation, intelligence or cognitive sophistication may be relevant. But if I ask you a different question, who should we use as a non-consenting organ donor or a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment? The less intelligent person or the more intelligent person? You say neither. Should we use the severely mentally disabled person in the biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor? Obviously we're going to treat the severely disabled person differently. We may not give that person a driver's license. We may not allow that person to participate in many activities in society because the person is incapable of doing so in a careful way. But does that mean it's okay to use that person in a biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor? I would say most of us would say no. Indeed, an argument could be made that the more vulnerable you are, the more our moral obligations, the stronger our moral obligations are to you. Okay, let me go on now to talk about the negative right of not treating animals exclusively as resources. Is there anybody in this room who is unfamiliar with the Michael Vick situation? Anybody? Anybody?
Come on.
Okay. Nobody is unfamiliar with the Michael Vick situation. Everybody was and still is. I mean, every time his name comes up, people call him names and they criticize him and whatnot. Why? What did Michael Vick do that was so very bad? Well, he inflicted suffering and death on a bunch of dogs. Well, why do we feel that that's such a bad thing? And the answer is because Michael Vick violated a rule that every single person in this room accepts. That is, it is wrong. We cannot justify inflicting suffering and death on a sentient being, human or non-human, without having a good reason. We may disagree on what constitutes a good reason, but we all agree that we need a good reason. Okay? And Michael Vick says, yeah, I enjoyed what I did. I found it amusing. You say, Michael, sorry. Your pleasure, your amusement in watching it, that's not a sufficient justification for inflicting suffering and death on non-human animals. Okay, how are the rest of us any different from Michael Vick? We kill in this world 56 billion animals a year for food every year, not counting the sea animals. 56 billion. That's a huge number. A billion is 1,000 million. 56 billion. That's just enormous. Enormous amount of suffering and death. And what's our justification? We don't need to eat animals. I mean, you've got vegan food here today. I haven't heard any complaints. I've been a vegan for 30 years. I ain't dead yet. And you don't need to eat animal products to be optimally healthy. As a matter of fact, more and more conventional medicine is telling us that dairy products, meat, eggs, all that stuff is killing us. But whether it is or whether it's not, you certainly don't need it to be optimally healthy, and animal agriculture is an ecological disaster. It takes between 6 and 12 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh. It takes 1,000 times more water to produce a pound of flesh than it does to produce a pound of wheat. Animal agriculture is destroying soil, destroying water, and the largest source of methane gas on the planet, the largest source of methane gas is not burning fossil fuels for transportation. It is animal agriculture. Animal agriculture is an ecological disaster. The best justification we have for inflicting suffering and death on 56 billion animals a year, not counting fish, is that they taste good. We enjoy the taste. How is that any different from Michael Vick? He likes sitting around a pit watching dogs fight. The rest of us like sitting around a pit, the summer barbecue pit, roasting the corpses of animals that have been treated every bit as badly, if not worse, than the animals that Michael Vick used. And don't buy into that stuff that you can go to Whole Foods and buy happy meat and happy dairy and happy eggs. That's a fantasy. That is a consumerist, capitalist fantasy to get you to consume. It makes you more comfortable about consumption. Those animals are tortured every bit as much as the animals in the non-happy context. Okay? So how are we any different from Michael Vick? I would suggest we're not. As a matter of fact, I wrote an essay some years ago called "We Are All Michael Vick," and it got quite a bit of response. I mean, I got well over 1,000 replies within a week from it being published in the Philadelphia Daily News, with about half of the people saying this is an interesting perspective, and the other half saying, I wish you were dead. Some people got really very upset about it. That I was saying, if you consume animal products, you've got no standing to criticize Michael Vick. I mean, you can't say, well, Michael Vick did it himself, and I just go to the store. So you people are law students, remember criminal law. It doesn't really matter whether you whether you kill someone or whether you pay somebody else to kill somebody. It's murder. As a matter of fact, it's easier to make a case for first-degree murder if you pay somebody to do it, actually. But in any event, all right. And I would suggest to you that all uses of animals, the use of animals for food, for entertainment, for clothing, for sport hunting, all that stuff, transparently frivolous. You don't need a complicated argument to understand why this is a problem. It's a problem if you accept that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on sentient beings, and if you agree that necessity can't constitute, that whatever necessity means, and we can have an interesting philosophical discussion about necessity, but whatever it means, it means you can't justify imposing suffering and death for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience, because if you did, you'd have an exception that would be so big you could drive a truck through it. So if you accept that rule, that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, and if you agree that necessity, whatever else it can constitute, it can't be satisfied by pleasure, amusement, or convenience, then you've got to come out to the same position that I come out. Okay? That basically you can't justify animal exploitation. And again, don't distinguish between flesh and dairy. There is no distinction between flesh and dairy. Animals used for dairy are kept alive longer. They're treated every bit as badly, if not worse, and they all end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. So this distinction between, people say, well, I'm a vegetarian. So what? I mean, so you don't eat flesh, but, you eat dairy. If you're eating dairy, you're responsible for it. I mean, frankly, if it was up to me, if somebody said, you got to eat this piece of meat or drink this milk, and you have to make a decision based solely on suffering, I'd probably eat the steak before I would drink the milk, because I think there's probably more suffering. There's certainly as much suffering in a glass of milk as there is in a pound of steak. So I think you've got to come out to the same point. Bottom line is, 99.9999999% of the animal uses that we make are transparently frivolous. They can't be justified by anything but pleasure, amusement, or convenience. And therefore, if you accept the moral rule that, whatever other moral rules you may or may not accept, I think we all agree it's wrong to inflict suffering and death on non-humans or humans without a good justification. Good justification is not satisfied, that criterion is not satisfied by pleasure, amusement, or convenience. So therefore, you can't justify any of this. Indeed, the only non-transparently frivolous use that we make of animals is the use of animals in biomedical science. I mean, first of all, I think that the use of animals in experiments is voodoo science. I think it's bad science for lots of reasons. But even if you think it's not, that requires a bit more complex of a discussion. That is, why do we think it's all right to use dogs or monkeys or rats or whatever in biomedical experiments? Well, we say, well, because they have some defect, they can't reason, they can't think, they can't use language. There are some humans that have those characters. There are some humans who are not as functioning cognitively as well as some dogs. But we would never think about using those humans in biomedical experiments, even if we would get tremendous results. As a matter of fact, most of us think of that as a monstrous thought. Why? Because we're human and they're not. But that's like saying we're white, they're not. We're straight, they're not. We're male, they're not. It's all the same. The otherization takes different forms. How we otherize, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, whether it's gay people, whether it's whatever people. We otherize them. I mean, what was the Holocaust? It was the otherization of a group of people. And once you put them on the other side, once you drew the line, put them on the other side, anything went. Everything was okay. That's a dangerous way of thinking. So in any event, the affirmative, there's a lot of confusion about what animal rights means, and people think that, I'm arguing that people should, that animals should be able to drive cars and go to school, and whatnot. I'm not arguing that. I've never argued that. I've argued one right. The right not to be treated as property. And that is an argument that I would suggest to you leads to a very radical conclusion. But it follows from something everybody in this room already agrees with. And in fact, I hope in the question and answer period, or perhaps when Professor Machan gives his presentation, someone's finally going to tell me, after decades of thinking about this, how that argument doesn't work. So in any event, thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to hearing Professor Machan and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for going first. I requested that because that the case for animal rights is fallacious. Not that there is nothing to value about animals, not that there is no moral responsibility or ethical duty toward animals. None of those inferences follow from the denial of animal rights. I also deny that animals have guilt, or that animals have regrets, or that animals are in any way responsible legally or morally for any of their conduct. I deny all of that, but it doesn't follow from that anything goes as far as human beings' treatment of animals. That's pure non sequitur. It doesn't follow. Now, as far as animal rights is concerned, the whole idea obviously begins with the notion that there are certain rights that at least human beings have. And in the American legal political tradition, these rights are usually associated with the work of John Locke, who argued that because we have a moral nature, that is, we can do right versus wrong, and we are responsible for what we do, we need a certain sphere of personal jurisdiction where we can exercise our judgments and where others can evaluate what we do as either being right or wrong. Certain things follow from that. If we are indeed morally responsible agents, then when we do something wrong, we become blameworthy. And when we do something right, we become praiseworthy. Well, that sometimes is transferred to animals. When, I don't know, a horse wins the Kentucky Derby, the rider usually pats it and says, you know, wonderful. But that's not the same thing as actually maintaining the horse has done something morally praiseworthy. Did something that the riders and the owners of the horse like, but it has nothing to do with the moral nature of the horse. Moral nature means that you do things of your own free will. And when you do such things, these things may be subjected to evaluation. There are certain criteria by which you can tell whether the choice to do this versus that was a good choice or a bad choice. This is an exclusive province of human beings. Granted, it is not a province of infants. Yes, most living things go through a period of maturation, and only at a certain stage of their development do they acquire all the capacities that are defining of them. Nonetheless, at the earlier stage of their existence, they begin to give signs of those defining attributes. So at a certain point of time, when a baby grows up, as a baby grows up, we start criticizing it, or we start praising it. In fact, we do so probably quite irrationally at times, simply because we like, especially our babies, and so we like to encourage some things and so on. But when we get serious about holding them responsible, then we start treating them as a human being, or at least nearly a fully mature human being. In fact, the law reflects that, because there's always a debate about whether, for example, to prosecute someone as an adult or as a dependent, or not to prosecute at all, because at that stage of its development, it couldn't help what it was doing. Now, animals never can help what they're doing, presumably because they're driven by instincts. They're not making free choices. They are hardwired to do what they do, which is one of the reasons we do not prosecute animals that are cruel to their fellow animals. We don't take lions to court because they devour zebras, and so on. We generally treat animals as beasts, as mindless, not mindless completely in the sense of no consciousness, but mindless in the sense that not subject to evaluation by criteria such as doing the right thing versus doing the wrong thing. You don't blame your dog for being dishonest. You don't blame your cat for being irresponsible. You don't blame your cockatoo too for not having the virtue of generosity. All of the human virtues that we prize about people, that we prize especially, say, in cases of political election right now, when we say, now this is a better person than that person, do not apply to animals. We can call them cute, we can call them pleasant, we can call them friendly, and all of those things, some of them verging on the anthropocentric, but nonetheless, they are clearly distinguished from mature human beings. That there are borderline cases, as with infants and babies and so on, that's like saying that chairs are not really furniture to be sat upon, because when you go to a museum and you sit on a chair, the chair collapses. Well, museum chairs are still chairs, even though they do not have all the attributes of regular chairs. And human beings, even though they're young and babies and infants and so on, their closest alliance is to mature human beings. They do not belong in some separate category of existence. A baby is a human baby. It doesn't become something else. And that's one of the reasons that we worry about the rights of children, for example. We don't worry about it exactly the same way as we worry about the rights of adults, but close enough so that, for example, a civilized legal system accords babies and infants a measure of standing, so that the legal system concerns itself about how they are being treated, but does not concern itself how rats or chicken are being treated. Now, there could be communitarian standards that people develop in favor of treating animals with certain consideration. And nothing follows from the fact that animals do not have rights that there shouldn't be any concern with how they are treated. That kind of false alternative is merely an argumentative device. It doesn't carry any weight. When you treat an animal cruelly, wantonly, when you kick it around and so on, it doesn't make it good or right just because the animal has no rights. It's not a category that we apply to animals. Again, just like we do not apply to animals the category of guilt or of moral responsibility. That doesn't mean that they can be subjected to any kind of treatment by us. Now, as far as there are so many considerations that were covered earlier that I have to recommend my book, because this actually does treat it, Putting Humans First, Why We Are Nature's Favorite. I am not being very coy here. I am saying that human beings are more important than gazelles, than your pets, or chicken, or even great apes. Not that they're not close. Great apes emerge toward almost a human characteristic by the time they are grown up. And obviously that's the lesson of recognizing that human beings are animals. They, however, are the highest animals when we compare them to other animals. And of course, even animal rights advocates recognize this. Most animal rights advocates do not include rats and cockroaches and other creatures as possessors of rights, nor do they recommend that the legal system be changed to treat them that way. In fact, the basis for most of those who do want to apply the concept of rights to animals tends to be one that is deployed by, say, Professor Cass Sunstein of Harvard University, formerly of University of Chicago, who believes that rights are granted to us by the government. It's an act of will, not an act of discovery. So we assign rights based on our interests and our reflections and our preferences. And if that's your source of rights, then of course anything goes. You can give rights to rocks, and of course there were people who did that not long ago. There's a book called Should Trees Have Standing that actually recommends the idea that even mountains should have rights. It leaves it wide open unless you have some connection with the nature of a thing, what has rights and what doesn't have rights. Because if rights are just assigned by human beings as an act of will, they're nominal. They're not natural rights. And the rights talk that I take seriously, and that I think the founders of the American Republic took seriously, and that many people who hold to some connection between a system of rights in the law, positive rights, and natural rights, like the Bill of Rights, for example, which in the Ninth Amendment pretty much implies that there are rights other than those that were spelled out in the Constitution. Those people believe that rights are indeed derivable from the nature of a thing. And if the thing lacks the nature that gives rise to rights, then that thing cannot have a right. And that's the point that I'm making with respect to my skeptical view about animal rights. Animals don't have rights because they do not fundamentally have a moral nature. The fact that there are some borderline cases and some fuzzy edges to this just teaches us that political philosophy is not geometry. And we should not look for the distinctions that are evident in geometry in the area of political philosophy, because we're dealing with living animals, very complicated living animals, and they will exhibit various attributes and capacities in different measure at different time, and that we have to adjust to. That's why we have intelligence and we're able to do it, and that's why the law cannot be made into a computer program, because the law requires discretion, whereas geometry doesn't require a lot of discretion. It's pretty much mechanical. Now, I noticed that the argument that I was presented with earlier kind of utilized a device that, in my view, is quite insulting. The idea that anti-Semitism is on par with anti-animal rights, that the Holocaust was something conceptually, morally equivocal to the slaughter of animals for food or medical research is quite offensive. I wouldn't go to many Jews with that thesis. It seems to me to be a stretch. But of course, it's always useful to have these extreme cases and line them up in your support, where you basically use the rhetorical device. If you are not for me, then you are for all of those terrible things that we all hate. But it's not going to wash. There are distinctions. Not all bad things are of equal weight. An assault is not the same thing as murder. Slapping somebody is not the same thing as putting a bullet through his head. Nonetheless, both things can be open to serious criticism. Now, treating animals badly or treating them even in such a way that is painful to them might be a lamentable thing, something we regret doing because without it, some of our other more important goals are not achieved. Nonetheless, they're not the same as murdering babies or murdering Jews or locking up blacks in slave labor camps or anything like that. That kind of equivocation is an argumentative ploy, but it doesn't get us anywhere near the truth. So I leave you with these few thoughts, and maybe during the question-answer period, you can extract from me more stuff that you can argue with. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, he's going to plug my books. I got more. I just brought two. All right. A few comments. much of what he said focuses on this idea that animals don't have complex cognition, that they function with instinct. I don't believe that that's true. You used the word instinct, and he said that they don't think the way we do. I agree that because we are the only animals that use symbolic communication and that our consciousness is linked with words, my guess is that the consciousness of non-humans is very different from the consciousness of humans. But I have no doubt that they're conscious. I have no doubt that they're self-conscious. As a matter of fact, one of the arguments I make and one of the distinctions I have with Peter Singer is that I believe that to be sentient is to be self-aware. You are aware that it is you who suffers, that you perceive, and that it is not some third party. So, but you know, so I think that a good chunk of what he says focuses on this idea that animals don't have complex cognition, or that they function on instinct, and therefore we can't really say very much about their behavior. But none of that is relevant to the argument I'm making. Indeed, much of what he talked about in terms of affirmative rights concepts are just irrelevant to the sort of thing I'm talking about. I mean, I agree. As I started off, the first thing I said was, I'm not talking about affirmative case for anyone. He's talking about constitutional rights. I mean, yes, I agree. The things that we think of as constitutional rights, rights of speech, rights, this sort of, rights of privacy, these sorts of rights, I don't think really, in the main, apply to non-human animals. So I think it's sort of silly to talk about it. And I'm not making the argument. If somebody else is making the argument, you can argue with them. I'm not making that argument. I'm making an argument for a negative right. That we have a moral obligation that we have not to exploit non-human animals. Now he uses this chair analogy. He says, well, broken chair is still a chair. Right, broken chair is still a chair. But a broken chair is not something that we say has the characteristic of being able to be sat upon. We could say, that's a broken chair, but you would not say that chair has the characteristic or the quality of being able to be sat upon. Okay? I agree that a disabled human is still human. That's not what we're talking about. So that's as far as his analogy goes. I'm not denying that somebody who's severely mentally disabled is human. I'm saying that if the criterion for having rights is that you have to be rational, that you have to be a moral agent, or that you have to have blue eyes, or whatever the magic characteristic is, I'm saying it doesn't. That if that being doesn't have the characteristic, then it's just sleight of hand to say that the being has the characteristic because the being is part of a species that generally has the characteristic. Just as it is a sleight of hand to say, well, we've got similarly situated humans, a male and a female, and we're going to give greater weight to the male's interest because he happens to be a member of a sex that we value more in a patriarchal, phallocentric society. Okay? Now, so I don't think that analogy works at all. Just to clarify something, he talks about Cass Sunstein. Cass Sunstein, like Peter Singer, is a utilitarian. As a matter of fact, Cass Sunstein reviewed Introduction to Animal Rights when it came out. Cass reviewed that in the New Republic. And he made it clear, when he's talking, utilitarians reject rights, reject moral rights as a general matter, because utilitarians are consequentialists. They say that what is right or wrong is a matter of consequence. Whereas a rights theorist says that certain things can't be done irrespective of consequence. So utilitarians reject moral rights. So I'm not sure, and it is, okay, I understand. All right, I don't understand his argument that if animals don't have rights, they don't, he's rejecting what I'm saying, but he's saying that animals still matter morally. I don't see how that could work, and maybe he can explain that. The business about anti-Semitism, I don't rank evils. It would be as stupid as to say, was it worse that Hitler killed Jews than he killed Romanies? If somebody asked me that question, I wouldn't answer it. I would say, he shouldn't have done anything like that. It's like saying, is the Holocaust worse than American race-based slavery? I'm just saying that we otherize, whether it's people of color, whether it's women, whether it's gay people, whether it's non-human animals, I don't care. We otherize, and once we stick you over on the other line, anything goes. The Holocaust is an example of that. An undisputable example of that. Final point. Tonight you got to go home. This is really very simple. It's not rocket science. Tonight you got to go home. You got to decide what you're going to eat. There is no conflict there. Even if you want to take the position that in every situation in which there is conflict, you're going to choose the human interest, that doesn't mean you can manufacture the conflict. If a lion attacks you on the way home, fine. Kill the lion. Tonight, when you decide what to eat, the animal's not attacking you. You have a decision as to what you're going to put in your mouth, what you're going to wear, what you're going to choose. You have a choice to make. And what I'm suggesting is, if you believe, as I believe that you do believe, that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death, and you agree with me that necessity can't be satisfied by pleasure, then I suggest you go to Veggie Heaven in Montclair, or one of the very, very fine vegan restaurants around here, or get yourself some fruits, vegetables, and nuts, and stay away from killing.
I'd like to start with the very end of his response. Notice how we are being implored to do the right thing and avoid doing the wrong thing. That was the thrust of the very conclusion of these few minutes of response to me. That animals do not have the kind of moral nature that we do, so you can implore us to do the right thing, but you can't implore a lion to abstain from devouring a zebra, or from a lion to abstain from devouring his very own cubs, which they frequently do. It makes no sense. They don't have a moral nature. And that is the thrust of my position, that rights are based on our moral nature. We need to have rights recognized in the social context so that other people do not interfere with our moral lives, our choices. These choices can be bad ones. They can be good ones. But that we are the kind of thing that makes these choices, distinguishes us from the rest of the animal world. There are a lot of things that the rest of the animal world and we share. And that's where those other considerations that are fully moral but not rights-based would emerge. For example, I will try to rescue my cat from my house, but not your cat from your house if it's burning. It's my cat, so it deserves my attention more than that cat does. Why? Because of a complex social relationship. I have basically committed myself to my cat, but not to his cat. So all of this kind of moral equivalence, as if it didn't matter what standing they had to our behavior, is not realistic. In fact, we do care about our children more than about other people's children. And not only that, we ought to care more about them because we have taken up the task. We have taken up the task of bringing them up, of being responsible for them. Whereas we did not take up the task to be responsible for our neighbor's children. This is a moral position that I made a promise to bring up my children carefully, attentive to their needs, and I did not make that promise to your children. You made that promise to your children. If we forget about this, a lot of things in our lives do not make any sense. And yet, and these are moral considerations, but they're not rights-based. They're responsibly based. Some of them are actually based on pleasure. I like my pets, but not your pets. Your pets are a nuisance. They make too much noise in the morning. They bark too damn much. My pets are sweetie pies. I embrace my pets. I'll rescue them in a fire, but not your pets. And there is everything okay with that. There's nothing morally amiss. There is something as a special status. Not everybody is of equal moral significance to you, to me. There are different relationships. Your grandmother deserves your care upon her old age, but doesn't deserve my care upon her old age. She's not my grandmother. Those things matter. I can't work it all out, but our normal everyday lives demonstrate this and show that, just as he tried to show that some of the things that we already believe about animals would be consistent with his doctrine of animal rights, I will show you that some of the things we believe about morality will be consistent with rejecting the notion of animal rights. There are some people I would like to mention. Probably the best person elucidating the position that I hold is a man named, actually a physician named Raymond Tallis, who discusses this, especially in his latest book called Aping Mankind. He demonstrates very intriguingly that this equivocation between other animals and ourselves is simply biologically and morally untenable. Again, just the point about negative rights. The negative right says, do not intrude on me. That's what the negative right is. And animals could have negative rights if they had a moral nature, but they don't have a moral nature. And so, for example, if they refuse to be neutered, we don't pay attention. We don't say, well, you have not given your consent to being neutered, so we are not authorized to neuter you. That is irrelevant because they cannot make a choice about those things. Anyway, many of these considerations are covered in my book, which, by the way, is about our topic here. It's not just a book that I have written. I have written 43 books. It's only one that I brought here to show you. Thank you.
We'll now open it up for question and answer session.
Craig, can I just make sure, Stan, it's not going to catch faces, right? Because we need releases from you if your face is captured on this, so it's not. It's just, okay, fine, good.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you. I'm Kenny Wagner, 3L, former treasurer of the Federal Society, and I'm going to be doing Q&A, although I'm going to take a point of personal preference and ask the first question for Professor Francione. So you've chosen to make the line of distinction between animals and other things that we might eat, such as plants or insects, as sentients.
I don't eat insects. I'm only kidding.
They could be sentient. It's hard to know. They don't talk much. So my question is, why is that any less than an arbitrary distinction as opposed to any other distinction that you might make?
Good question.
I'm sorry, and just as a follow-on to that, or as a proposal for what might be an alternative, so how about what's in the Declaration of Independence, that the concept that rights come by being endowed, by virtue of being human, and by being endowed by our Creator with certain rights around nature, and that in and of itself distinguishes us from any other creature.
Well, once we start getting into religious discussions about Creator, then we can have all sorts of disagreements, because some people believe in a Creator, some people believe in a Creator God, some people don't. But to answer your first question, the reason why sentience is a necessary and a sufficient condition for having an interest. That is, in order to prefer, or an interest is something that to say X has an interest is to say that X desires or wants or prefers something. You can't, if you're a plant, you have no nervous system, you have no mind, you have no sort of mind. You're alive, okay, you're alive, but you have no sort of mind. There's nothing that you prefer, you desire, that you want. Sentience, once you are sentient, and it may be difficult to know where the line is. As Ken mentions, maybe insects are sentient. I don't know. I don't step on them. I don't kill them when I find them in the house. Okay? I don't know whether they're sentient. But I do know that all of the animals we routinely exploit, the chickens, the pigs, the fish, the cows, the lobsters, all of those animals are clearly sentient. What about clams and mussels? I don't know. I don't eat them anyway. They may be sentient, they may not be sentient. I don't know. There are a lot. We don't have all the empirical knowledge that we need to have. But all of the animals we routinely exploit are sentient. So there's no question about that. And sentience is not arbitrary, Ken, because if you don't have sentience, you don't have interest. A plant does not care about what I do to the plant. Whereas an insect, if the insect is sentient, on whatever level the insect perceives the world, the insect does care. But certainly dogs and cats and fish and lobsters and pigs and chickens and all that, they all care. All of them have some sort of mind that prefers or desires or wants. Plants don't. And when you say, to your second question about, as I mentioned at the outset, I have a difficult time talking about a creator God because I don't necessarily subscribe to that sort of way of thinking. But I would say this: the Declaration of Independence is dealing with affirmative rights for human beings, and at the time, for white property-owning human beings, by and large. But it's dealing with certain aspects of affirmative human rights. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about do we have a moral obligation to recognize that animals have an interest that ought to be protected with a moral right? I'm not even really focusing necessarily on a legal right because I don't think that the legal aspect of the right is the most interesting aspect. We're not, I mean, the legal aspect is not the most interesting aspect, and it's not the primary aspect. The question is, do we believe as a moral matter that animals have an interest in not being treated as resources? That interest ought to be treated as a right, with a moral right, i.e., it's an interest that should be protected irrespective of the consequences of my pleasure in eating the animal or my pleasure in wearing the animal or whatever. And so that's what we're talking about. And all I'm saying is you don't need the Declaration of Independence. Tonight you're going to sit down and figure out what to eat. You don't need the Declaration of Independence. You don't need any sort of theory of affirmative rights. You just need to ask yourself, do you believe that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on any sentient being? And do you have any better reason, other than your pleasure or your amusement, in participating in the suffering and death of this non-sentient being any more than, say, Michael Vick did in having dogs? That's the only question. It's really quite simple.
So just if you have a question.
Can I contribute to the
Oh, sure.
Also, let's make these responses kind of short.
That we do. Let's try and get in as many questions as we can.
The Declaration doesn't say that God created human beings, but that human beings have a creator. It could have been evolution, it could have been Santa Claus, it could have been whatever. The point is that our rights are based on our human nature. All that the Declaration commits us to. Those guys were not stupid. They realized that we live in a multi-religious, multicultural country. Even back then, we did. And so they didn't want to rest their defense or the foundations of the system on some particular ideology or religion. So they said, creator. Creator is completely neutral. It could be secular, it could be religious.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And when I call on you, give us your name, your class, and your affiliation. And please keep your question in the form of a question.
David Vitale, I'm a first-year member of FedSoc. Professor Francione, I just wanted to ask about plants and how, the line that you're drawing. If you make a room dark, a plant is going to move towards light, right? They're going to make a decision. I don't know. I'd say they make a decision, but they move towards a food source. They change their behavior, or they alter themselves in some way to make a decision to try and survive based on what you've done to them. Now, that seems to go counter to what you said that bugs or clams and mussels and plants are somehow different. And I was just wondering if, is that really the line? What separates them if they can make that kind of decision for themselves?
Well, you're saying that they're making it. Your name is David? Mm-hmm. David, you're saying that they're making the decision. They respond to stimulus. I mean, a stimulus. If you run an electrical current through a wire, the bell will go off. But we have no reason to believe that plants have any sort of mind whatsoever. And it really wouldn't make sense to say that they're sentient. I mean, plants can't do anything. I mean, if you take a cigarette lighter and you get it near a dog, the dog will run away. If you take a cigarette lighter and put it near a plant, the plant will just shrivel up. The idea that plants would evolve sentience makes no sense because it would be a vestigial characteristic right from the outset, and we don't think that evolution moves in that way. But you know what? Even if you believe that plants were sentient, which I think there is no basis for, you would still be obligated not to eat animals because it takes between 6 and 12 pounds of plant protein to produce every pound of flesh. So if you really believe in plant sentience, then my suggestion is you eat as few plants as possible, or commit suicide. I mean, you've got two choices. You eat as few plants as possible, or you commit suicide. But the idea that, well, if plants are sentient, it's all right to eat animals, that doesn't follow at all. But I also think that the argument in favor of plant sentience just doesn't make any sense.
Hi. I'm not a law student. I'm a lawyer, but I'm a friend of Professor Francione. And, I mean, I have a lot more statements than questions, but I'm going to put it in question form. Professor Machan? Machan, sorry. You talk about what is moral nature. And if you think about moral nature, I'm just thinking about dogs, how they're loyal. I think my dogs are more loyal than any friend I've ever had. So that, to me, is a sign. You're saying animals don't have a moral nature. Do you consider loyalty a sign of moral nature? Then you started to talk about lions, that they eat their cubs. First of all, I wanted to know, have you ever taken a course in ethology? Because you've made a lot of statements about the nature of animals, and it seems to me that you never did take a course in ethology. But I'd like to know about what you think about moms and dads who abuse and kill their babies and their children. Do they have moral natures?
Yes,
They
they're
do.
vicious for that.
Okay. But they
That's
have
one of
moral
the reasons
natures,
we
but a dog
convict
who's
them
loyal
in
doesn't
the
have a
court of law
moral
and put them
nature.
to jail, whereas we don't do that with the lion.
Okay, but a dog who's loyal doesn't have a moral nature, but a mom who kills her baby
Everybody
does.
have a chance to ask questions.
Okay.
Everybody just one question.
Is there behavior on the part of some animals that reflects on, similarly on our case of loyalty? Yes, they stick to us, they hang close to us, they follow us closely if we go on a trip and so on. Rin Tin Tin comes back from very far away. You know, yeah, sure there are similarities, but they're not the same thing as equivalence. As far as I'm concerned, nobody has, well, there was back in the early days where they actually did put animals to, they convicted them in courts on the grounds that they were inhabited by devils when they did the wrong thing. But I think we're past that right now. So if animals do something damaging, say a dog bites the postman, or a horse kicks somebody, or such things, very few human beings would say that this deserves moral condemnation.
Right. We just
That's
put
what
them
I
to
meant
sleep.
by having a moral nature.
Any more questions?
Yep. You're both very persuasive, you won't like to hear. So I have the following question to both of you. What is the best argument of the other position? Could you just, for a moment, step back and ask yourself, is there, you don't have to say it makes it, but what do you think is the best argument of the other position?
Well, I think that Tom Regan, in his 1980 book, The Case for Animal Rights, published by University of California Press, made a formidable case for animal rights based on the consideration that they have certain mental capacities that we share with them, and they are relevant to the issue of rights. I don't think it succeeds, but I think it's a formidable case. And I would generally say that anybody who wants to come to terms with this issue needs to be a close student of Tom Regan's work, especially when they talk about rights. When it comes to animal interests,
That's a different...
that's Peter Singer, and that's a different song.
So I think that the argument that because animals are, the argument that Bentham made, that Singer picks up on, and that sort of the standard utilitarian, that animals don't care about the fact that we use them, they only care about how we use them. So they have an interest in not suffering, but they don't have an interest in continued life, so that it's all right for us to use them as long as we treat them humanely. I think that's an argument that is accepted by a lot of people. Now, I think it's problematic for reasons you and I have discussed, animals are chattel property, therefore animal welfare standards will always be low, and will only protect animal interests when humans get a benefit from doing so. But I also think it's a speciesist conception of self-awareness to say that, that animals are not self-aware because they don't have human awareness. But I think that that's a facially appealing argument, and it's one which is accepted by a lot of people. And those are the people who go to places, to the expensive supermarkets and buy the Happy Apes and the Happy Dairy and the Happy Dead Corpse or whatever, because they believe that using animals is okay and that the issue is treatment. I think the problem is, obviously, treatment is a problem, but the general problem is I don't think we can justify the use at all, however humane it is.
Any other questions? Okay, I'd like to
I just want-
thank our speakers again for joining us. It's a very lively and informative debate. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and as well remind you that next Wednesday at 12:35 we're going to be having a debate between Dr. Robert Levy of the Cato Institute and our own Professor Frank Askin on the constitution of the healthcare reform, the Patient Protection Act of 2010. And again, a gourmet lunch will be served. We look forward to seeing you then.